Hi, everyone.
Hi, thanks for joining, everyone.
Yeah,
I see people coming in now.
yeah,
We'll get started just in a couple of minutes.
yeah. I can't believe that this is the final webinar in this series already.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
it's
gone by
nice
quickly.
to see it through and plan it all out and have the last one. I feel like we need to celebrate after this, Laura.
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah. Yeah. Have some cake.
That's what I'll do.
Yeah.
We should have put special rewards out for someone who joins all four.
Yeah,
You win
I
a
think
slice
so.
of cake.
Yeah, let us know if you've been to all four.
Yeah.
Maybe give it a couple more seconds to see if we've got more people joining. And after that, then we'll just get going. It seems like it's a stable number now.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so welcome to the fourth webinar in our series, the fourth and final webinar in our series from research to publication, a researcher's guide to open access. Today, we're going to be covering open access agreements with what do open access agreements entail. This webinar will be recorded like our previous three webinars, which are all about the researcher journey with open access. They'll all be on our website on the events page on chronoshub.io. So they're all recorded in there, and this one is going to be there too. I'm Laura Davidson. I'm a customer care specialist at Kronos Hub. And I'm also a PhD student as well. So outside of my role at Kronos Hub, I'm also studying towards a PhD, so I'm also a researcher. I've worked for universities in the UK. I worked for universities in the UK prior to starting at Kronos Hub. I worked in universities for about 10 years in a combination of administration and teaching roles. So that's really where my open access journey began before I joined Kronos Hub. And today, as always, I'm joined by my colleague, Romy Beard. Romy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, my name's Romy. I've been working in scholarly communications since I left university, actually, for the last 17 years. I've worked at a publishing company with technology providers, consortia and libraries signing different agreements. So this is really, like one webinar I was probably looking forward to the most, because I've done some negotiations with publishers and worked with libraries on implementing agreements and done some analysis on seeing it through. So I'm quite excited about this one. I've been at Kronos Hub for about a year and a half, and I mostly work with publishers actually in a publisher relations role, but also have some input with institutions on how they use Kronos Hub.
Great. So the agenda today, we'll be talking you through what OA agreements are to begin with, and then we will be taking you through a bit of the context behind why there are OA agreements, or why there are open access agreements. Then we'll take a quick look at the sample agreements, and then at the end, like the other webinars that we've been doing, we'll give you some resources to look at, so where to find agreement information. And as well, like if you've got any questions that you have whilst we're talking, please feel free to put them in the chat, but we'll also pause at some time through the presentation as well if you've got some, just to give you a bit of time to ask questions then as well.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So as always, we thought we'd start with a quick definition. What are open access agreements? Generally, what we mean by this is agreements that cover article processing charges, either in full or partially on behalf of authors. So authors don't have to pay APCs. And these agreements are usually negotiated by an author's affiliated institution. So the institution where you're currently working or doing your research. Sometimes these agreements are also between funders and publishers directly. So it has to do with your funder rather than your affiliated institution. And the agreements come in all shapes and forms. Can be called read and publish agreements, publish and read agreements, transitional agreements, transformative agreements, or indeed open access agreements, which I guess is a little bit more of a general term. And generally with these types of agreement, what happens is that a publisher and institution negotiate, and the agreements cover both a subscription fee to read the paywalled content, but also a fee that covers the publishing costs. So our authors can publish open access for free. And the aim is to really bring that kind of spend on the one agreement and on the one fee, but also the goal to increase open access publishing to make more research openly available, so it can be read more widely. And some agreements cover all publishing, others are limited to a quota, for example, a certain number of articles per year. Some agreements only cover certain article types. So there's quite a lot of like variety within the agreements, and we'll look at one sample agreement in detail. But yeah, this is just to give an idea of the breadth that you might encounter. What we want to include as well here really is institutional membership. That might give you a discount because some of the same issues apply to that, as well as country waivers and country discounts. Again, author recognition, something we talk about, also apply in that case. A bit less so, I guess, with funders, but in this case, it's funder recognition. So it's also covered by the term, the way we use it, term of open access agreements.
Okay, so we're just going to start a little poll here. So does your affiliated institution have any OA agreements with publishers? So do you know if, I'll just launch the poll now, if your affiliated institution has any open access agreements with publishers? So that the poll should have popped up on your screen now.
Yep, I can see it as well.
Yeah. You can see the results coming in now. Let's give it a couple more seconds.
Good. It's always nice to get an idea of if this is relevant to you, which side you come from, if it's just hypothetical, but actually agreements that are already in place, or perhaps agreements that you know that are coming but haven't actually been used yet.
Yeah. So I think most people have answered now, so I'll just quickly end the poll and we can see the results.
Oops,
Share
sorry.
them with you.
Oh yeah.
So
There they are.
83% of people, yes, no, you know that you have an agreement with some publishers, and then 17% no.
Good. Well, I hope that the ones that don't have agreements get something out of this as well, and maybe look where there are agreements where you don't know that you have an agreement in place to the institutions. And hopefully for those that have agreements in place, we can provide some more clarity if perhaps you're a little bit confused of what it means and why it's important to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So let's get started then with the next piece, which is the next part of the webinar, where we want to talk a little bit about the context of why these agreements are in place and why they're important before we dive into the examples and how to deal with them and what they mean for you as a researcher. So the most of these agreements tend to focus on hybrid journals, where publishers would get revenue from articles being published open access. So they have APC revenue from publishing authors, but they also have subscription revenue from institutions paying to access the paywalled articles. So to remind you, hybrid journals are journals that have both open access and closed access articles. And the two revenue streams, they can be called double dipping, and a lot of publishers now have policies against this, but early on institutions noticed that publishers were getting money from these two sides of the ecosystem, and started negotiating agreements with publishers called offsetting agreements. And initially they were vouchers. So if an institution subscribed, they were given a vouchers for a certain number of articles that could be published open access. They're like an APC voucher that could be used. But now more and more, it's a lot easier process. It's more all-inclusive. A lot of times it's on a national level, and then all authors from a country or all authors from certain institutions can publish articles open access for free. So a lot more of these agreements have been signed, certainly over the last 5 years or so, and as I said earlier, they combine subscription and publishing costs, hence why some of them are called read and publish, or publish and read. There's a bit of a difference between read and publish and transformative agreements. Transformative agreements really tend to try and move towards a fully open access world and have more of a transition plan where you see the read fee decrease and the publish fee increase, with the aim to really exit that and live in a purely open access world. So there's some nuances within that as well. But generally people are paying attention to where authors publish, and if APCs are covered, and also what's called APCs in the wild, APCs that aren't controlled because authors might pay them themselves and they're not paid for by institutions. So as an institution administrator, you don't know exactly what's being paid in APCs. So mostly centers around hybrid journals, and we talked in the introductory videos, the introductory webinars about the different types of journals that are out there. There are also agreements now that more and more include gold open access, so fully open access journals. Sometimes it's perhaps only a discount on fully open access journals, and the bulk of the agreement is for hybrid journals. A good resource to start with, if you want to get an idea of how many agreements are out there, is the Esac Registry of Transformative Agreements, and they list a good chunk of agreements by publisher and also by country, so you can have a look there, and it gives you a general overview of what the agreement covers. These are generally registered by institutions, not by publishers, so perhaps doesn't cover everything, but it's a really good starting point if you want to know if your country or certain publisher has an agreement in place. You could have a look there for general information. And Esac also does quite a lot of research, collects information and research on the output. So as I said earlier, the aim of these agreements is to increase open access outputs, to bring us closer to a fully open access world where more people can read articles for free without any paywalls, without having to get access. And here you can see, this is also on the Esac website in the Market Watch, the output of this, and you can see drastically from when these agreements started in about 2018, the effect of that, then how that increased in open access. And now I think it's like, yeah, we're hitting nearly 500,000 of articles that are being published openly through these agreements specifically. And there's probably more out there that we're not even counting because perhaps the agreements aren't registered. So this is really encouraging to see that these agreements are actually driving open access, and that's quite exciting, I think. The other thing that's really important, and we talked about the definition of corresponding authors, a lot of these agreements are based around the corresponding author role. So this is generally the main contact, is the person that receives the email updates about the article's progress, the peer review decision, and it's also the author that would pay the APC or that would trigger like the non-payment of an APC because they might be eligible for a read and publish agreement, for example. So it's something to think about also when you're collaborating and working on an article. Who is the corresponding author? Might be you might want to discuss that if there's any choice to see, well, who could get free publishing for this publisher or that publisher. So perhaps something to think about, who will submit it if you all work closely on an article. And author recognition is really important in the triggering of these agreements. And we'll go look at some examples in detail later on. But this can be through institutional email address, which is not really a catch-all, I don't think, but some publishers use this. So they look at the kind of the end piece of the email address to identify authors and say, okay, if everyone with that email address comes from that institution, I know I don't charge them an APC. But some authors also use Gmail addresses and other addresses. So I think that has its added downsides as well. Another way to capture authors in terms of recognition is institutional affiliation. And I think this is also has its drawback if it's not like a set field. So if you don't use persistent identifier, if it's like a free text field, everyone will go in and spell it slightly different. Oxford University, University of Oxford, or whatever. It's hard for then publishers to catch it. So a lot of publishers now use identifiers where you start typing, as you can see in the screenshot on the right, and a number of options pop up, and then you select the relevant one. So that's really the best way to do it, to make sure the system really catches who you are. And for funder agreements, it tend to be based on the fund ref ID. So before we look at the sample agreement, I think there was a question. I've seen something in the chat, Laura. No, it's just a smiley face and a thumbs up to Vivi for attending all the webinars. Well done, Vivi. Are there any other questions just now before we dive into this example? Or will I just crack on? I can't see any other questions. No. Right. So we thought it might be useful to look at one agreement in detail. As I said, every agreement is different, right? So this is not going to, explain how all agreements work, but I'll give you an idea in this specific example. And we thought we'd pick a recent agreement between Wiley and the Danish Royal Library. So who does it cover in terms of institutions? It's actually a list of Danish universities, I think all the Danish universities, and some other research institutions. It's valid until the end of December 2025, so still quite a long way to go, because it's been only recently signed, only from January onwards. And this is an agreement that has a cap. So it's not unlimited publishing, but it's 1,110 articles, I believe, per year that can be published through this agreement without APCs. So any article above that number will be given a 15% discount on the APC and has to pay the remaining 85%. I believe, from what I understand, that's actually not done on the author, but then that goes to the institution as part of the agreement. But that was actually a little bit nebulous when I looked into this agreement. In terms of journal types, as hybrid only, it's about 1,360 journals, which I believe is almost all the Wiley journals. I think there's 1,385, so maybe some of them are not included because they're society owned, or perhaps they are included and the title list hasn't been updated. That's also possible, but almost all the Wiley journals, which is great. And in terms of article type, according to agreement, it's original research articles and review articles, and some other types are excluded. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So when you look at agreements, it might be that I think that in general everything's covered, but sometimes it's worth looking at the nitty-gritty to see, is my article, does it fall in this category? Is it actually in a journal that's included in the agreement? Because it could be that it's not included. And is there a quota that I need to be aware of? I mean, in this case, still middle of the year, so you're probably safe, but if you get nearer to the end of the year, it might be something you could be worried about as an author. In this case, in terms of licenses, CC BY is a preference, and although exceptions are allowed. So again, something to bear in mind. If you don't want to publish CC BY for whatever reason, you want to publish a little bit more restrictively, non-commercial, non-derivative, that's possible, but then you need to ask for an exception. So bear that in mind. If you look at the website, on the Danish Royal Library website, you get some information on in terms of instructions for authors and what to do during the process. And there's also a link there to a static title list in PDF. So that would be one step for you to check that list to see, is the journal that you want to publish in, or a number of journals that you might want to consider included in the agreement before you're thinking of submitting. On the Wiley website, you then have some more detailed instructions for authors. So this is one point I want to make. It's for you to find out about agreements for your institution. I think your library page is the first place you want to look at, because most universities, university libraries publish a list of all their agreements on their website. But then do make sure you check with the publisher's website as well, because there can actually be some discrepancies between them, and you'll generally find a lot more detailed instructions on the publisher's website. Not for all, but it might be worth looking into that. So in terms of this agreement, first of all, make sure that your institution is included in the agreement. There's a list of the Danish institutions that can be found there as well. And then make sure you select the right institution affiliation. So if you perhaps have two institutions, make sure you pick the one that is actually included in the agreement. Otherwise, your article won't qualify. And then there's different Steps in the workflow. At step 1, you have to select open access, and then later on, you have to confirm again that you want to make your article open access for it to be counted as part of this agreement. So something to bear in mind, and there's some more information on this flyer that Wiley has produced. The other thing I dug out in the instructions for authors that it's at the point of acceptance. So it's the acceptance date that counts the triggering of the count towards the agreement. So something to bear in mind, if you make a submission towards the end of the year, it could actually be that you get accepted in January, so you're part of the new quota, whereas if it's near the end of the year, you might go over the quota if it's accepted really at the end of the year. So that's something that's not always in control of the authors of when they get accepted, of course. So a bit of a delay there. Let's see if there's any other questions about this particular sample agreement before we get into some of the examples of how you might want to find out more about agreements, on where they're available, or some examples of how institutions promote them. If you've got any other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Don't think there's anything coming through. Can you see anything, Laura?
No,
so
not
the chat
yet.
keeps
No.
disappearing. Okay. Well, we've tried to really make this as a resource for you to look at and find some potential ways to find out about agreement. And I've split it up into 2 parts. One is pre-submission information on university websites and publisher websites, and we'll look at some examples. And then during the submission process, how author recognition happens and what to be aware of there. And we touched on that a little bit already. So in terms of pre-submission tools, we've got the first example to mention is the Planner's Journal Checker tool. Now, this is relevant if you also have a funder, and that'll tell you if publishing through an agreement, it tells you if there's an agreement that's in place and if that makes you funder compliant, because some funder compliance depends upon certain agreements. We talked about that more in our last webinar, specifically around funder requirements. But this is still a tool to find out information about agreements, especially if you also have a funder. So please check it out. Here we've got an example from Springer Nature and how they disseminate information about their institutional agreements on their website. They split it up into fully open access agreements, partnership agreements, membership, individual institutions. So this covers the fully open access journals, and then transformative agreements, which tends to focus on the hybrid journals, although I believe that also now includes the fully open access journals in some agreements. And then it's then split up by country, so you can select your country or your consortium that you're part of, and then you get to another page, which is the one that with the blue box around it, where you can download a list of eligible journals in Excel, as well as an author guide, and in some cases there's a list of participating institutions if the agreement is a consortia agreement. So you might want to select your country, but then also check, is my institution actually part of the agreement, or perhaps they haven't signed on to it and it's only a neighboring institution where my co-author works and he could become corresponding author. So worth looking at. Then we've got an example from the American Chemical Society. They use Kronos Hub for their journal finder, where you can enter an institution. So it's a little bit more fluid. It's not a static spreadsheet, but you can actually enter your institution and then get information on whether agreements are in place for their journals. And you can also filter through the journals and do another bunch of cool things. But good to find out which institution is part of which agreement. So not based on country, but just on the institution. Another example is Cambridge University Press. They have an open access waiver and discount checker tool. I think that's what they call it, where you can select your country first and then your institution and find information about publishing agreements, and I believe also title lists. So that's also worth looking at. Then we've got some examples from libraries. Your starting point is probably your library. As I said, probably should have done this the other way around. You check where you're registered. But it might also be if you're checking on behalf of all your co-authors and you know already where you want to publish, you might want to publish. You might want to start with the publisher and who of you might be eligible for an agreement. So actually it could be either way around. University College London has quite a good website where they list all of their transformative agreements by publisher, as you can see on the left. And then if you open the little triangle button, you get a list with more information, including title lists by Excel that you can search in most cases by subject area as well. So your library might have a similar way of promoting their agreement. Certainly most university libraries have a page with all the agreements with the publishers that they've signed. Here's another example from Max Planck Digital Library. Again, this is more of a tool rather than static information, where as an author you can search and do some filters like by subject area before you get information on whether publishing is covered. And this one specifically, you can only search the journals for all their agreements, so you don't have to search by publisher, which is quite nice, but it doesn't include all agreements. So I think this is the 10,000 journals that they have included in their agreements to search across them. Another example is University of Lausanne, where you have about 46,000 journals, and then the relevant journals that have an agreement in place are marked with that information. So a slightly different approach. This is the Kronos Hub Journal Finder for Lausanne, and you see here the information that is displayed in their case. So those are some examples for pre-submission tool, what I would check. So what I would call pre-submission tool. So if you know where you want to publish, or you want to find out relevant journals that might be eligible through the institution side or through the publisher side to find information about that. In terms of kind of cross-publisher, cross-library tools, we looked at the Planner's Journal Checker tool if you have a funder, but there's also, again, the Esac Registry that I mentioned at the very start that gives overviews of some agreements that have been signed. So then in terms of during submission, the workflow for that really depends from publisher to publisher. And as we saw in the detail for Wiley and the Danish library, there's certain steps you have to go through as an author. And this example is again from University College London, and I've just looked at some of the examples, and you can see how it varies from publisher to publisher. First, when you submit, you have to do your institutional affiliation. Some of them are really have to redo it later after acceptance. You get asked specific questions that they alert you to how you need to answer that question for the article to go through that await process. So bear in mind that it's different for each publisher. So look at the instructions once you know where you want to submit. Here's an example from Emerald and their Kronos Hub workflow, where you're automatically alerted, and there's other providers that do the same, that for their publishers, if you're in the process, there's an alert that tells you, hey, you're eligible, you should be covered by an agreement. But again, it's really important to make sure you check the right institutional affiliation, because everything is based on that. Even if it's an automatic recognition and not a manual process, you still need to do that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is missed open access. And I think that is one of the problems still. Having done a little bit of analysis in my previous role into whether articles that are actually published are included in agreements or not. So we looked at articles that were published in closed access that should have been open access because they were eligible for either a full waiver or a discount, and tried to dig into a little bit on what the reasons were for that. And in some cases, I think it's the author is not aware of an agreement and didn't follow the instructions. Some publishers don't have a workflow, and it's something like you have to email the editor to claim your discount or to say you want to be part of this agreement, which obviously if you don't know about it at all and you don't know these instructions, you've missed an opportunity. Other reasons could be because the publisher's workflow didn't recognize the author, didn't pick up on it. maybe there's an automatic institutional name recognition, but you overwrote it with a manual way of writing your department or your institution, and therefore didn't get picked up. Could be that it's not the right article type. We saw at the start that some agreements are restricted to certain article types. It could be that yours was a discussion paper and therefore it wasn't included. Then it could be because as an author, maybe you didn't choose the open access option in one of the steps, or because open access wasn't the default. I think some publishers like Cambridge, I know, work quite a lot now on making sure the open access is the default. And if you don't want to publish open access, you actively opt out, whereas some are the other way around. Closed access is the default and you actively have to, vote to publish your article open access. And I'm hoping that more publishers will go to that kind of default open access, but that is another reason why sometimes, although you're eligible, perhaps you just miss this kind of tick this box here and are pushed in that direction, or you see different agreements and you don't know what it means. The other thing when looking at title lists is that it could be that a journal that you think is part of an agreement is actually not part of the agreement. It could have moved to a totally different publisher in the meantime, or it could have just been excluded because of society ownership, or because there's differences between title lists. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well, to double check on the journal homepage as well, if it is actually included in the agreement, and try and dig a little bit into it in case of any doubt. So there are things to be aware of. And I think we get into some questions now.
Yes, so we have some questions that we get frequently asked in customer care. And actually, in customer care, we don't usually deal so much with these open access agreements, because as Romy has been describing, usually if somebody is eligible for one, publishers and the systems that they use will pick up on that before the invoicing process starts. Usually we'll receive invoices from researchers when they've been billed for an article processing charge. So it's unusual actually that we come across questions about open access agreements, but they do come up because, like as Romy has just explained, there can be situations where the open access in eligibility has been missed because maybe somebody typed in the system didn't pick up the affiliation or anything like that. So we do get some of these questions. So one of them that we have had recently, a researcher spoke to their university library about adding an article. I spoke to my university library about adding my article to an open access agreement. The quota for this year is full. What can I do? So I think in this case, we referred them back to their library because there could be various reasons for that. It could be to do with I think Romy, you said at the beginning, to do with the point in the publishing process that the article could be added to the quota. So maybe if some things are kind of changed around, I think the article could be added to the quota. And also I think with this case, the university library maybe passed it on to another university library as well, that you could see that there was other affiliations in there too. But I think it depends on the publisher and also the dashboard that the library have that they use for the publisher to manage these agreements.
Yeah, I mean, it varies so much from publisher to publisher and institution to institution. It could be if there's like a real hard stop that say, okay, we cover 100 articles and anything after, usually the institution would negotiate, do they pay for it? Maybe they've got an open access fund. And although it's outside of the quota, they actually have some money to cover extra articles. Or it's totally like, no, you're on your own, you're the author, deal with it, we have to pay for it. And it also depends on when this happens. As we saw, I'm assuming at this case, it's already post-acceptance, because a lot of the agreements, like the Wiley one, is based on accepted state. So you already submitted, your article's accepted, and now you're like, whoa, well, I thought I was going to get this paid for, and now I don't. This is a really tricky situation, obviously, for an author. You might want to check if you could, one of your co-authors has eligibility, if their institution hasn't filled their quota, or if they have unlimited agreements in place, and you could do a change in corresponding author. I think a lot of publishers now are wary about that, and what you put in as corresponding author at the start, that's what you have to stick with. but I'm sure there's exceptions that could be done. So that's something worth exploring. So I would say first check with your library, your institution, librarian, if there's any funds to help you cover it, if there's any way that it can be pushed to the next year perhaps, and if that's not possible, check with your co-authors if there's anyone that could cover it there, but also need to ask the publisher if changing corresponding author is something that is possible. I think more publishers, actually our next webinar, or one of our webinars at the end of June is about authorship and the different roles and how they're just this burden on the corresponding author that wasn't meant to be, is now corresponding authors are being used for all these agreements, and that wasn't really the role originally of the corresponding author. It's the person that submits, and perhaps it's even an administrator that sends in the article and has nothing to do with the writing. But now that role is so crucial, and publishers saying you can't make any changes to it. So that's perhaps something where we'll see changes. And I know some agreements, like PLOS agreements, for example, don't just look at the corresponding author, but also co-authors. So there's a little bit more fluidity in that.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's so complicated, but it's like the key thing is go back and speak to the library, speak to the librarians and see what they can do. And also, there could be other reasons for why it wasn't added to the quota as well. So it might not just be because they've reached the amount of articles that they're allowed per year. There could be other things that are going on as well. So always speak to your librarian.
Yeah, they're your friends to help.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Okay, so the next question that we've been asked at Chronos Hub customer support: my funder has rejected funding for my article. Can the open access fee be covered by a read and publish agreement? So this is quite unusual actually, but not that unusual that an author would come to us having had funding rejected. Perhaps the article that they've had published is in a hybrid journal. But you've maybe heard something that there is an agreement between their institution and a publisher, which means that you can have open access articles published for free. So I think, again, go back to your library and find out if the journal that you're published in is part of the agreement, but also try and find out, I guess, why I would try and find out why it wasn't picked up by the publisher in the first place, because I think it's quite an unusual situation. Although, again, like we said, it's not that unusual that the open access was missed the first time around.
Yeah, it might also be dependent on the kind of priorities that the publisher set. I would think if there was an agreement that covers all articles, that would take precedence over any funding arrangements, any funder paying for it. So your article, if it was, should have qualified, if there was automatic recognition, should have already given you that option to publish open access to be counted for. But it could be that your funder, or the funder in this case, says, we want to pay or you assumed the funder would pay for it, and that's why you chose not to accept, the voucher to cover it as an agreement. So there's a number of scenarios that are possible. But the short answer is the OA fee can be covered by a read and publish agreement if it qualifies, and if it's not too late. Because as you can see, we looked at author instructions for different publishers, and a lot of them insist on a certain step that has to be taken during submission. So if you haven't done that, most likely you've missed the opportunity. But always worth exploring, worth checking. Check the title list, check it's the right type, and again, contact your librarian because they'll be best advised.
Yeah, it's like the pre-submission process that you were saying. Follow that guidance. So hopefully it doesn't end up in this kind of situation. Yeah. So I think we have one final question from Hester here. Yeah. Should I request, so this kind of nicely leads on from what we've just been saying. So we've had a question, should I request my funder pays for my article, or should I go by the open access agreement route?
Again, it depends on the agreement. If the agreement has a quota, then maybe you're like, oh, I can get my funder to pay for it. Someone else can use the quota that might not have any funding.
Yeah.
But if it's an unlimited agreement, then why should you use your funder's money if your institution is in a way already negotiated that it's covered? And it should really be covered through the agreement in that case. So it's a bit of a gray area, I would say. Some agreements like this are also kind of done in conjunction with funders if it's a national funder, and if it's a national agreement, there's maybe backing from the funder in the agreement, and the two work together, which could happen as well. And a lot of the initiatives around open access like OE 2020 have a lot of funders involved even in the negotiation process with the big publishers to say, well, we want this to happen. The funders actually demanding the open access. So it shouldn't be like a war and, oh, which one should we take? But it could be that your funder is not a national funder and the agreement is a national one, or an institutional one even. So it really depends on a lot of things.
Yeah, but it might actually depend as well on the journal type. So it could be that your funder will cover the journal type or not. And I suspect that if the funder will cover the journal type,
fully open access journals,
take that route. But if the funder doesn't cover that journal type, so say, for example, your funder doesn't cover hybrid journals, then it would be better to go through the open access agreement route if that journal is part of the agreement. So it could be like thinking about how the different how people manage the different resources, how institutions manage them.
And again, really important to check before you submit, what does your funder actually cover? And what could be covered through an agreement. And it could be a combination of both. This sounds like a pre-submission question, doesn't it? So
yes, it is. It definitely is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions we've had prepared. But if you've got any others, please pop them in the chat. We've still got time. So this is the series complete, the fourth one done. If you've missed any of the previous ones, please go back and watch them. We recorded them. Why should I care about open access? We dug into like different license type, different types of journals, different types of article versions. What does archiving mean? Archiving open access versus publishing open access, really the basics, but in detail. And then number 2, we've looked at APC specifically, and what do you need to do to pay for them, and when do they apply, what do they cover, what's included, and issues around that. And then the third webinar, we looked at funder requirements in detail. We looked at some funded policies in detail, what they would pay for, like Laura mentioned earlier, some of them might pay for only fully open access journals, but not hybrids, other cover hybrids. Some of them require a license, others don't. So if you have any questions around that, go back and watch that. And then finally today, we've dug into open access agreements and what's covered. If you've attended, love to hear from you. Please get in touch. We've also got some other events coming up. These are some conferences we'll be attending, but on the events page, you'll see as well other like educational webinars we run for publishers and institutions. So we've got one at the end of May where we talk about affordability issues around access and publishing, which you might find relevant. And end of June, we talk about authorship and data, including looking at things like corresponding author roles, which we touched on today. And yeah, any comments, please get in touch on social media, or if you have any questions.
And all the webinars and all the slides from the webinars as well are available on our events page. So you can, this is a resource that you can go back and to look at and to share with other people as well.
Yeah, and feel free to use them if you find them helpful in your work, if there's any pieces of it. I can't see any questions, so I think we'll wrap up, and thanks everyone for attending any of the webinars, or if you're watching this again, thanks for listening. And love to hear your feedback. If you have time, drop us a line. Love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.